Hello, everyone. Sorry, I had some joining difficulties, but those have been cleared now.
Hi, Mr. Asiko. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm fine.
Good.
Please, Frank, Mr. Asiko sounds too formal.
You'll be amazed at how deserving that is today. This is probably the highest registered webinar we've had in the history of AVPA. So it demands some due respect.
Congratulations.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us. So as people are trickling in, William, let me just get people warmed up a bit. So guys, as you come in, can you please use the chat group chat function to tell us your name, your organization, and where you're dialing in from, as in country or city. If you can let's just get to know each other a bit. Your name, your organization, and where you're dialing in from. That would be really cool if we can do that. And William, thank you. This is, we have over close to 650 people registered for this webinar. Yeah, so it tells us that the topic, speaker, or both are very relevant to this discussion on the group today. So we're super excited to have this many people registered, and it's really cool to see this. But thank you everyone for making it. So if you can just, as you come in, let us know your name, your organization, and where you're dialing in from. That would be awesome. And we'll get started in a short while. My name is Frank Aswani. I'm CEO of AVPA. I look forward to engaging in what promises to be a really exciting conversation. For the next hour and a half or so, we'll be engaged in what promises to be a really exciting subject. So I'm really looking forward to this. But thank you so much. So for everyone who's made it. So we do expect about 200 people to join this webinar in the process of the next couple of minutes. So thank you so much. So if you can just tell us your name, your organization, and where you're dialing in from, and that would be awesome. And then in another minute or so, we'll get started. It's good to see some familiar names on here, people who've been with us for a long time. Melvin from Portugal, welcome. Rihanna from South Africa, welcome. Abiola, Ishtoleram Foundation, nice to see you. Thank you for making it. Tracy from Chikululu, great to see you. Acheng Butler from Nairobi, nice to see you. Luis Guimarães from Maputo. Bom dia. Welcome. Kerubo from Nairobi. Karibu sana. Saline Handa, welcome. Shiru from Acumen, nice to see you, Shiru. Your Pepra from Cape Town, Goodwill Investments, great to see you. Mujenia Seli from Junior Achievement, nice to see you. Riyadh from Trialogue, awesome. Vuta, Van der Spain, long-term partner of AVPA, nice to see you. Memuna, great to see you. Mike Muchilo, nice to see you. Yeah, I think, Abby, we can get started with some of the stuff that we need to get going before we get into the cracks of the conversation. So thank you everyone for making time to join us today. It's a really exciting time. Abby, if you can just go back to the preceding slide. It's a really exciting time for us to be having this conversation. And I'm really glad to have my long-term friend and partner in this space for a long time, William Asiko, join us in this very pertinent topic of Catalytic Capital. As I mentioned earlier, for those who were here before, we've had the highest number of registrations for this topic. Over 600 people have registered for this topic and for this webinar. So we do look forward to an engaging conversation. And just for information, this is the beginning of what promises to be an exciting build-up towards a catalytic capital program, an investing program that AVP is planning to roll out sometime from the second quarter of this year in collaboration with the C3 Consortium, the Catalytic Capital Consortium, which consists of Rockefeller, MacArthur, and Omidyar. And so it's really pertinent that we have William Asiko, the VP for Rockefeller Africa, with us today. Before we get to ask William to speak to us, Abby, can you go to the next slide? I want to just give you a bit of a heads up on some stuff that we're going to be doing. So that's our agenda for today, but just looking forward to the next couple of weeks in terms of, and months in terms of what to expect from AVPA, from activities. So this is the first of the Catalytic Capital webinar series that we're going to be having. There's another 2 to come. I'll share with you the date of the next one, which will be in February. This will culminate in a training program in April. We are starting to do, now that we are post-COVID, a lot more regional convenings. So please keep your eyes and ears on the ground for some impact convenings that we're planning to have across the continent, starting off with South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria, mainly around the capital cities of those countries for over the next couple of months. I'm super excited to be doing something around trying to influence the impact space in Africa, after being in global circles where not enough is being told about African stories and the work that we're doing to help ourselves, the innovation that's happening on this continent. I have decided to start a podcast series featuring African impact stories. And I shall be launching that podcast series the first week of February. I count on you to help me find some of the stories that we probably don't hear about, stories that inspire us, by us and by friends of Africa who are working with the continent, but fundamentally stories that can help others learn and replicate some of these models that are being done, solving similar problems in different countries. And we're also looking to conclude in the next 2 or so weeks a study we've been doing in South Africa, mapping out the state of innovative financing research, and that we're hoping we can replicate in multiple countries. And then we've got a program we're working to build university capacity in impact and sustainable finance on the continent. Right now, the continent of Africa, despite being arguably the biggest impact opportunity, we only have 1 university that teaches impact and sustainable finance. And that for me is unacceptable. So to address that issue, we've been working with a consortium that was actually set up by the Rockefeller Foundation called the Impact and Sustainable Finance Consortium Faculty. And we've created a train the trainer module through which we want to recruit and take about 30 African business schools, so we can have this subject taught at scale across the continent. So look out for that. That's another really super exciting program we'll be working on. In the second half of the year, I'm very excited to announce that we're collaborating with the National Advisory Boards for Impact Investing. I'm not sure that you all know about them. There are 5 in Africa. These are the boards tasked with growing impact investing across the continent. There are 5 NABs in Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Zambia, and Ghana. And we're partnering with them to host Africa's first Impact Summit in Cape Town, July 12th to 14th. And one of the most exciting things about that particular summit is not just about bringing together players in the impact space from across the continent and beyond who are passionate about advancing Africa, but we'll also be launching officially AVPA's membership on July 12th in Cape Town. So keep an eye out for that as well. And then as usual, we've got our impact investing fellowship program starting in September. With the growing popularity of that program, we are taking in applications now. So if you do have any need to be part of that program, please start applying now. And then the Africa Healthcare Funders Forum that we kicked off last year is ongoing at the moment. So if any of you is a healthcare investor that wants to join a group of existing African healthcare funders who are building a community of practice, please speak to us. For all of these things, there's an email there, info@avpa.africa. Please use it to connect with us, and we'll be happy to connect with you and share with you more information. So next slide, Abby, speaks to the next webinar that we're going to be having in this series. Glad to have Natasha Dinham from Rules of Impact. We'll be having a conversation on Thursday, 23rd February. Next slide, Abby. And as I mentioned to you, I decided to do something to address the lack of African content in the global space around impact stories that are driven by Africans. So I'm starting a podcast series, recording my first episode on Monday next week, and that will be out from the end of next week. But from 2nd February, you can actually subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. Okay, so that is it, I think, Abby. So what we're going to do now, William, over to you to do a bit of an introduction of yourself and the work that Rockefeller does. And for everyone, thank you so much. As usual, if you're coming in now, please put your name, organization, and where you're dialing in from in the chat. And as we go through this conversation, if you've got any questions, please use the chat group to post any questions. I'll try and answer and get to as many of them as possible. If not, we'll find another way to make sure that you get answers after this session. But William, first of all, thank you so much, William, for making time to join us. It's really great to have you here. It's an honor to indeed you as a leading impact player on the continent to kick off this conversation of what is a very juicy subject in the African impact space. So William, over to you.
Thank you so much, Frank. And let me also say thank you for having me on this platform. And let me congratulate AVPA for attracting such a broad audience. I mean, when names were popping up there, I could see a lot of names that are recognized from my past and my present. And then what I also really like is the diversity and geography of where some of those who are participating on this call are coming from. So congratulations on that, and I expected nothing less. So I think, as Frank has told you, my name is William Asiko, and I'm Vice President for the Africa Regional Office at the Rockefeller Foundation. And I know that some of you will have read a profile about me either on the internet or on LinkedIn. I know that I'm connected to very many of you. Some of you know me personally. And there is just one important thing I do want to say as you go through my profile is I obviously started my career in government. And then I spent nearly 20 years in the private sector. And then now I've spent the last 10 years really working in the development sector. And so this will become important later on as we go into this discussion, because I really do want to talk about those three sectors. And I'm going to base a lot of, the arguments I am making about impact investment on the fact that I think these three sectors are not necessarily working together as effectively as they could. And I can understand that, having the experience of having worked in them. So that's me. I think on the Rockefeller Foundation side, Rockefeller is not new to, the Rockefeller Foundation, I should say, is not new to impact investing. In fact, some of you may know that the term itself, impact investing, was crafted at a Bellagio convening that was hosted by the Rockefeller Foundation and its Bellagio facility. And so impact investing, the term itself, actually comes from the Rockefeller Foundation. We're not new to that. We have seeded a number of organizations that are heavily involved in impact investing. And I would urge you to look at the Global Impact Investing Network, which is a global network that was seeded by the Rockefeller Foundation, has fantastic resources available, and is working hard to mobilize impact investing dollars. And so, if you do have time, I'd urge you to look through their website. And there are others. The Rockefeller Foundation has a long history of seeding organizations that then go on to do other things. In Africa, we've been involved in the Green Revolution. We've been involved in setting up public health institutions. And I've obviously talked about impact investing. So this is not a new space to us. I'm particularly pleased to be talking about this topic today, because I do think that it's come at a very timely moment in the history of development, particularly here in Africa. We know that today Africa is facing a myriad of challenges. And we also know that despite years of investments that go into the billions of dollars, and perhaps some would argue even the trillions of dollars over the past 60 years, since many countries started getting their independence in Africa, many countries still remain, in a state of poverty. And a lot of the basic necessities of life are still not available to many Africans: electricity, medical services, hospitals, schools. Many Africans are facing a lack of these things. And so we do know that the development model is not as effective as it could have been. And I hope that we can talk about some of that as we go forward, Frank.
Thank you, William. So you've been heavily involved in the setting up of the C3 consortium, William, as Rockefeller Foundation. We've tried to kind of understand what's been your experience in Catalytic Capital, and especially if you've done any work in Africa. And I know you have done some extensive work as a foundation around that particular space.
Thank you. So let's talk about Catalytic Capital in general, first of all. So, the whole idea of Catalytic Capital is how do we find a way to use limited resources available from potential investors or from foundations such as ourselves to attract additional resources either from the public or the private sector, but largely the private sector. And how do we do that? That is the role of Catalytic Capital. And the Rockefeller Foundation has been involved in such investments almost from the very beginning. We have a culture, like I said, of seeding new organizations, and we find that is a more sustainable approach to taking towards development. However, Catalytic Capital, I think, plays a different role, because what Catalytic Capital is trying to do is to unlock funds that otherwise might not be available to do public goods in the world today, okay? And so the fact that we can take first loss positions in private investments, we can take positions that other potential investors might not look at to de-risk a potential investment in a social enterprise that has got some public benefit, I think is an important role that we see. And because of this, because of how important this work has been for us, 3 years ago, we established RF Catalytic Capital, whose idea it is to bring like-minded funders to find funding solutions for these challenges. We know, for example, that Africa is woefully short of the resources that it requires to meet the SDG goals by 2030. And we know that perhaps one third or perhaps even a half of African nationals may not see the benefits of the SDGs by 2030, should we maintain the current trajectory. And so we felt at the Rockefeller Foundation that there was a need to go into more detail and get into more arrangements around Catalytic Capital, and hence the establishment of RF Catalytic Capital, or RFCC, which allows us to do this at a scale that we wouldn't be able to do as just strictly as a foundation. Following soon after the establishment of the RFCC, RF Catalytic Capital, we also established the Catalytic Capital Consortium, C3, that you spoke about, Frank, which brings together other strategic partners, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation and the Omidyar Network, to pool our resources together to try and use them to attract additional funding, especially in social enterprises. And so the C3 consortium is exactly that. It's a consortium of these three partners. We started initially with an investment of $10 million, and that is now rising even as we speak. We see a lot of interest in this, and we will talk later on about our Zero Gap Fund and what that has done to the catalytic investment space.
So, William, you mentioned something I want to take you back to, this whole thing about Africans potentially missing out on the benefits of the SDGs just because the trajectory we're on is not fast enough. Is it that bad? Are we in a really bad situation? And, you know, I've heard quite a bit about people talking about aid to Africa not coming at the required volume and that. What's your view about just what's happening? And is this the right time for us to be looking at a different model of driving Africa's development?
I think so. I think so, Frank. I think that we are at a stage in Africa's trajectory of development where there is a sense that something needs to change. I think that there is no one public sector entity, there is no one private foundation that has got sufficient capital to bring transformation on the continent at the levels that are required. All right. But I think one area that we haven't examined in depth is the private sector and how the private sector resources and commercial interests can be aligned with development goals so that, we can get the level of investment that we require. We know, Frank, that countries that have lifted their populations out of poverty at scale have done so largely through growing the economy and creating jobs for their people. I mean, there is no shortcut to eradicating poverty. You have to grow the economy by doing the things that will allow business to develop, will allow private sector investment to take place. And through that, you create momentum and commercial activity in the economy that then leads to jobs. There is no shortcut. The development model has to be based on creating income earning opportunities for people to undertake in order to lift your people out of poverty. And I think perhaps this is an area in which Africa needs to do more around. We know that the private sector is interested in undertaking commercial activity in a way that is friendly to the planet, but is also inclusive of all sectors of the population. Many private sector multinationals and smaller companies have stated publicly their commitment towards doing more inclusive business that protects the environment, business that provides opportunities to the less fortunate, business that supports local farmers and local value chains. We know that these commitments have been made by the private sector, but I don't think that our development agencies, and ourselves included, and governments have taken enough advantage of this interest by the private sector to be more inclusive in their commercial activity. And as I spoke about earlier, that's why I think it is really important that we find models where the public sector, the philanthropic sector can work with the private sector so that everybody's interests are met. And I think that's the only way we'll get effective development at scale and perhaps change the trajectory that we're now on to miss the SDGs by 2030.
William, you mentioned something very interesting about the private sector. I'm going to come to that in a short while. But before we go there, we do want to do a bit of an exercise just to warm the crowd up a bit. So we're going to use a tool called Slido. So everyone get your cell phones out or be ready to do this. So if you've got a camera, use the QR code, scan the QR code there. We just want to engage with you a bit on where we are. So this is just some warm-up questions, and we'll use this a bit more as the session goes on. There is a link in the chat that takes you to the same slide or question. So if you can just use that, your cell phone camera, please point at the QR code and tell us which country you're dialing in from. I just kind of want to sense where our broader representation of people in this call is from. So we'll give you a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds to do that. So just your QR code or use the link in the chat. So it's good to see that there's a very global representation of the audience, which is great to see that there is interest on this subject, not just as a standalone subject, but the subject in relation to Africa. So if you please use your phone. Quite a big representation from Kenya and South Africa. Good to see a lot of Europeans here, people from Belgium, the UK, Francophone Africa, the US, all the people in America who are on this call. Thank you for waking up this early. I can imagine it must be like 6 a.m. in the morning, if not even earlier. So appreciate you being with us here today. This is a very early start for everyone and I'm hoping that no one is dialing in from the West Coast. That would be even worse. So second question is, what sectors does your organization work in across the continent? If your organization works in any sector, let's get a sense of what sectors you work in. So government, it's great to see government because they're a very important part of mobilizing capital. And one might argue that your governments are probably your biggest grant makers or holders of catalytic capital on any country. So this is great. So a lot of people in philanthropy, education, energy access, impact investing, social enterprise. Okay, there's still a lot of people typing, so I'll wait a bit. Nice to see private sector people here as well. HR, talent development, climate. So another 10 seconds. Sustainability. Okay. So William, as you can see, we've got a really good mix of people in the audience. So this is great to see. So William, let's go back to the question on private sector. The private sector has not traditionally been a player in development. And so, but if you think about it logically, and as you said that we need to look at how we're going to finance this stuff, the private capital markets are arguably the biggest pool of capital in the world. I think the last I checked was something like $430 trillion. How do we go about this? How do we go about making private sector show an interest in investing in some of these sectors that traditionally they haven't been part of, whether it's health, education, or poverty eradication, but the kind of stuff that's specified within our SDGs?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question, and thank you for that exercise. Super exciting to see the broad geographical representation, like I said at the beginning, but also very important to see the depth of professionals that we have and the broad nature of the professionals and sectors that are represented. And the reason that is important, Frank, is that we need everybody. All those sectors that are represented there actually need to be working together, underlined, in order to change the trajectory of Africa's development. So really good to see that level of expertise. Now, to your question, yes, traditionally the private sector has not been involved in development, all right? But I think that there is, over the last 20 years or so, and largely driven by young people who are a lot more conscious of their environment. They are a lot more conscious of ensuring that companies are operating responsibly in the communities in which they do business, in the countries in which they do business. A lot of companies, the private sector, are beginning to want to be more involved. I think that there has been a desire to be more involved, but I think what you're seeing today is a groundswell of engagement with the private sector, with government, and with civil society. We are certainly seeing that with us, and a lot of our programs today have got private sector partners, and we do try to have private sector driven solutions to the challenges that we're trying to deal with. But the difficulty is, Frank, is that these three sectors do not necessarily speak the same language. And I'm not talking about a language like Shona or Swahili or Wolof. You know, the fact is if you take somebody who speaks Swahili today and somebody who speaks Wolof and somebody who speaks Shona, and you put them in the same room and they try to have a conversation, what's going to happen? It's going to be disaster. They're not going to understand each other, and nothing is going to get done. To a certain extent, that's what we're seeing with these three sectors, is that those who have been in philanthropy sometimes started their careers in philanthropy and have been there throughout. They've never understood how the private sector works or what is important to them. Those who've been in the private sector, often exactly the same. Those who've been in government, often exactly the same. And so when you try to put these three to work together, to align their interests, it hasn't always ended up in the way that we want, okay? And if we're going to access the trillions of dollars that are available in capital markets, we've got to crack that nut. We really do have to crack that nut. Now, most people in government or philanthropy, they are like, well, the private sector made, they'll point to a particular company that is publicly quoted, so they have to share their results publicly. They'll say this company made billions of dollars last year. Why don't we just take 1 billion of that and put it into development projects for water, for schools, for hospitals somewhere? We'd solve the problem very quickly. Actually, the private sector doesn't work like that. The private sector, that money that has been made, that is publicly announced, does not belong to the company. It belongs to the shareholders. All right. And so the company cannot make decisions like that to take $1 billion out of their profits or out of the operations of the company to put in development projects. All right. People in the private sector think, government should show up with infrastructure. They should make investments in electricity. Our electricity is too expensive because the government hasn't done its work. And so they're like, you know what, I'm not going to work with the government because they haven't built the roads that I need. They haven't built the telecommunications, the electricity that I need, and so on and so forth. Without realizing that governments are in a very tight fiscal situation. Many governments are struggling even to meet their recurrent commitments, let alone put aside money for development. And so this is the language I'm talking about, is that the failure to understand each other's objectives, all right? And so there needs to be an understanding of that. Now, one area which I think could bring lots of resources and that could serve the interests of both public sector and private sector, as well as those of us in philanthropy who are trying to bring transformation to disadvantaged communities around the globe, would be the idea of aligning a company's commercial interests, all right, with development goals. Now, what do I mean by this? So, for example, many companies, all right, big multinational companies have made global public commitments. If you go to their websites, you will find these commitments there to buy their raw materials, the ingredients they need for their products from Africa. So if a company like Unilever, which has made that commitment, or indeed Coca-Cola, which has also made that commitment, if those companies, they publicly commit that we want to buy the ingredients we use for all the products we sell in Africa, we want to buy the raw materials and the ingredients from Africa, all right? Now, that's great. You can imagine the value chains for a company like a company like Unilever could impact. Companies like Diageo, Heineken that have made these big commitments, they could impact value chains across the continent if they put all their procurement dollars to purchase from local value chains. All right? Wow, sounds simple. Sounds great, doesn't it? All right, why don't we just buy all the sugar we need, all the palm oil, everything that we need to make products for Africa from smallholder farmers, all right? That would solve the problem. Well, not quite. The challenge is there has to be investment in building these value chains, all right? And so because companies, one thing that a global company wants is quality and consistency, all right? So that their products that they offer for sale in countries in Africa are the same as the products they offer for sale in other parts of the world, all right? So they need a level of consistency. They need a level of standards that can be met by these local farmers. And then they need quantities. They need large quantities, and they need them, you know, they will focus the demand for you for the next 3 years and say, produce all these pineapples or mangoes or passion fruit in this tonnage for the next 3 years. Somebody has to work to build those value chains, all right? Because today, many of those value chains are inefficient, they're broken, they are not able to produce the products at the produce at the levels of quantity and quality that are required for the private sector. And so that those opportunities to impact these value chains are going, you know, unmet, because these companies have put them out there, but the private sector, commercial money is not going to pay for the capacity building and the technical assistance that is required to develop those value chains. That is the work where I think catalytic capital can play a role, all right, to help, you know, maybe SMEs, smaller companies, cooperatives, with the technical assistance that they need in order to develop those value chains. Philanthropic capital, you know, can, in a blended finance solution, can help in those kinds of areas. But putting together these partnerships is very difficult, because you need government, you need philanthropy, and you need the private sector to be working together. You need each of these sectors to be patient, because, you know, developing a value chain, especially from scratch, you know, today, you know, to make beer, for example, you need hops. Hops is, you know, not a crop that is widely grown in Africa. So if a company like Heineken says they're going to buy all their hops for their products in Africa from Africa, somebody's got to build a value chain from scratch, all right? So that it is able to support the procurement requirements of Heineken and other companies that require that. So you can begin to see where the difficulties are, all right? But there is hope. We are working on just those kinds of solutions that bring the private sector together with government and using philanthropic capital to help to develop value chains to support you know, the growth, and they use this private sector commercial capital procurement dollars to help smallholder farmers and commercial farmers on the continent benefit from this sort of procurement.
So William, if I hear you correctly, in many of these places where we need to develop solutions, there might be solutions that are probably at a stage where they can't attract the kind of investment capital that we need to create sustainable impact in the long run. And if I hear you correctly, this is where we should be thinking to bring in more catalytic capital. So what do you see as the evolving role of philanthropy and a philanthropist? So the philanthropists in this crowd today, who are sitting here and are thinking about how can we magnify our impact, for example, because you said, you know, that's what places catalytic capital would play. Do you see an evolving, at the topic of the day, do you see an evolving role of philanthropy in this space? Do you think philanthropy should be seeing themselves differently, and just your view on that in particular?
Frank, yes, I certainly think that we in philanthropy need to be seeing ourselves differently. I think we need to be tying much more of our grant capital towards private sector solutions and to catalytic capital solutions. We definitely need to do that. I'm not saying that there is not a role for philanthropy to be building hospitals and schools and those kind of things. However, you know, building a hospital as infrastructure, for example, without having a plan for how that hospital will be staffed and you know, where the drugs are going to come from, you know, you really don't help. So you really have to think about development challenges holistically, about how is this hospital going to be staffed, all right? Where are pharmaceuticals going to come from? And so you then begin to see that it makes sense, perhaps, to, yes, think about bringing partners together to build the infrastructure, but also invest some of your capital in SMEs that could be part of the pharmaceutical supply chain, for example. Invest in training of medical staff. invest in increasing the capacity of medical staff, the technical capacity of medical staff. So you look at challenges holistically and invest your dollars in ways that would make it sustainable. A growing area today is working with the private sector to develop medical institutions. So the private sector would put up the infrastructure to build a hospital, and philanthropic capital could be used, for example, to support the training of medical staff. It could be used, like I said, to build supply chains that would supply the hospital with food, with pharmaceuticals, with all sorts of things that they would require. Philanthropic capital would be very useful in doing those kind of things, so that the costs of what is a venture that may not be one that a private sector entrepreneur would think of immediately as going into building medical facilities. But with those sorts of blended finance solutions that catalyze them to make the investment in the infrastructure in the hospital, those things then begin to look attractive. Okay, so again, looking at the example I gave of a company that has decided that they want to source their local raw materials locally, and perhaps those raw materials are agricultural produce. Philanthropic capital can be used for the technical assistance to develop cooperatives, to aggregate smallholder farmers together, to make sure that they have the right seeds, they have the right inputs to produce the quantities and the qualities that the private sector will require. So if you do this in conjunction with the private sector already committing to build the infrastructure in the factory and committing their procurement dollars over time towards this cause, you can then begin to see how we are going to transform the continent. 70% of Africans today work in some level of agricultural activity. Many of them are smallholder farmers. So if you're able to crack that, crack the aggregation of smallholder farmers to work together to produce one or two products that are being bought at scale by a private sector player, you begin to see how you can change the value chain, and you can change the face of these private sector farmers who are playing. So yes, philanthropy does have to see itself different. It does have to start talking to the private sector. It must continue engaging with government at a high level, because government's got to come in with policies, enabling environment to allow the private sector to invest at scale. They've got to do public goods, building roads, infrastructure, electricity, bridges and things, providing port access and those kind of things. So everybody has a role. Everybody has a role. But you do need, and I think philanthropy can play that coordinating role, bringing people together, creating platforms that bring private sector and government together to align on what is required to make investments successful.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, William, from that perspective. And we look at all the time, we always hear the story that Africa has more capital than it has investable pipeline. And that is not totally true. I mean, partially, yes, there's some truth to that, but partially is also because we don't have the investors coming to Africa with the kind of flexible instruments and blending that enables the right kind of capital to get to African entrepreneurs in the right format at the right time. So, for example, I think if you look at a lot of our young entrepreneurs at an early stage, they're very high risk. Most commercial capital players, investors won't touch them. But from what I'm hearing you say, that's the place where now your philanthropists can come in as early stage investors to help them get to the proof of concept stage, where now more commercial capital can come in. And we see quite a lot of, for example, in healthcare, especially this public goods sectors like healthcare and education, and with declining aid, there's a lot of an emergence of social entrepreneurs in that space. But they need that early support in the early stages to help them propel to the point where they can become attracted to more commercial players in the process. And it ties to a question that Bijuvidi has asked in the chat, is that do you see a role for philanthropic capital to support more small businesses to grow to the point where they can access venture capital through new acceleration or incubation services?
Yes, look, again, and I'm glad that you caught that, I guess, misconception that Africa has got, there's more capital than projects in Africa. It is a misconception to some extent, all right? There is certainly a lot of capital. And I think that, today, the level of private sector interest in Africa has never been higher. All right. The level of interest in emerging markets and capital in emerging, it's never been higher. All right. But like you say, how do they evaluate risk? That's the challenge. Mm-hmm. How do they evaluate risk? And I can give you an example that perhaps will shock many people here. So if you take Africa as a whole, all right, our debt to GDP ratio is on average less than 50%. And yet, many African countries are debt distressed, all right? They're struggling to meet their commitments to pay. And the global financial institutions, and especially the development banks, who I think have a role in this, will not look at the situation and say, Africa is developing. We've still got many things to do. And so the risk profile cannot be the same as the risk profile for, say, a European country, all right? So here's Africa sitting with a debt to GDP ratio of less than 50%, many African countries, yet they cannot access capital or the capital markets because they're considered too risky. Mm-hmm. Italy today, one country in Europe, has got a debt to GDP ratio of 123%, all right? Which means that they've essentially borrowed a much higher amount than the entire GDP. Greece, when it suffered its financial problems, was in a debt to GDP ratio of about 110%. Yet these countries continue to access finance. What's going on? All right? The way that we assess risk is the challenge for many African countries. They are considered risky, and because our development finance institutions do not want to lose their AAA rating, they're very risk averse, and they're sitting on billions of dollars that could be lent to African countries to support their development agendas. So we have a challenge there. We have a challenge, and I think Africa must begin to take charge of this conversation. I don't know how many people have heard of the Bridgetown Initiative. The Bridgetown Initiative is a financial reform initiative that was started by Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, hence the name Bridgetown. And her goal is to say, look, the development finance institutions need to change their models. They need to change their models to take into account lower and middle income countries and not assess the risk of these countries based on the risk that they assess European countries and other more advanced countries. And so this is an ongoing conversation that's happening. I really do hope that something's going to come out of it. But I do agree that there are a lot of projects, there is a lot of money around, but the way risk is assessed, not just for countries, but even for projects, even for individual SMEs, is a challenge. And to the question in the chat, that could philanthropy fund specific, I guess, SMEs or companies to a point that they will, be able to access venture capital? I think the answer is broadly yes, all right? But let's not forget that philanthropy can only fund certain things, all right? Because of the nature of philanthropy, because many of these philanthropic dollars are put in trusts, in foundations, which have been settled by donors, Bill and Melinda Gates, John D. Rockefeller, to do public good, to do things that are of public benefit. They can't just fund everything. The companies that they would take first loss on would have to be companies that have demonstrated that they have some level of public good, all right? And at this stage, I'd like to show you, for example, one investment that we made, the Rockefeller Foundation. I don't know, Frank, if your team could put up the leapfrog slide that we sent earlier. So, what we did here is that we looked at a particular fund, that was funding essentially companies that were going to places that other companies would not go. So banking the unbanked, clinics in places where there was no medical funding. And so these were companies that were doing things with a public good. And we put money into this fund. And because of that, this fund was able to leverage that money by 90%. And grow the fund to nearly $500 million. All right. So yes, the answer is yes. Philanthropy will fund individual companies and leverage that funding to seek venture capital, to seek equity capital, and to seek catalytic capital. But it depends on what activity that is being undertaken by this company. Does it have a public benefit or not? So it's very, very important that we see that there is a wider objective than just commercial profits in this particular case.
William, absolutely, and I'm a believer of if a company is deserving of concessional catalytic capital, it should ideally be aligned to a company where there's quite direct convergence of profit and purpose. That this is a company that believes doing well and doing good are not mutually exclusive. Yeah. That they are looking to both be sustainable by making money, but at the same time deliver social impact, whether they're creating jobs for women, creating jobs for youth. So I totally agree that I think if you're going to get access to this kind of capital, you've got also to give back to society something that will help society become a better place, broadly speaking. So I don't think this kind of money should go to the kind of investments that are just purely financial, broadly speaking. That kind of money can come from other sources that are not necessarily the kind of philanthropic capital we're looking at. Now, speaking of which, and to your point where you're talking about, that philanthropy may be constrained by the kind of structures that have been set up, the trusts, the governance structures, and those kind of things. Is it time that we actually challenge the structure that some of these philanthropic organizations are set under, so they can actually become a lot more representative of the bigger impact agenda, where they can be part of the growing capital stack and the changing paradigms of the evolving role of philanthropy? And with that, for example, do we need to almost going through a re-education of the philanthropic network? The human capital part is what I'm talking about, is the boards, the management team. Is it time now for us to just think about unlearning and relearning new competencies and skills?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Frank. Look, I do think that there is always room for improvement and learning. And, certainly at the Rockefeller Foundation, we've gone through a lot of learning. In fact, one of the things that we're doing as of last year is making strategic learning and impact a part of everything that we do. And what that means is that for every project that we fund, we will assess what we learned from that project and what the impact is or should have been, and if it didn't achieve the impact, why. And the reason we're doing that is we want to learn. We want to learn what we can do well. We want to learn what we can do better. All right. And where we're doing well, we want to increase that. Where we see opportunities, we want to learn from those and eliminate any sort of weaknesses in the system. So there's always room for strategic learning and impact. That one we do not disagree. The challenge is that there is a very limited amount of room to fundamentally alter how philanthropic foundations, especially private foundations, work. And that's because of the laws under which they're established. The biggest private foundations are found today in the United States, right? And the United States foundations are regulated by the US IRS. And once you settle money into a foundation, it can only be used for certain purposes and used in certain ways. Obviously that makes very good sense. The government, the IRS doesn't want you giving your money to your foundation and then using that money for commercial purposes. So they have to do it strictly and rightly so. And so they do that. So there is limited, I guess, room to maneuver on how foundations are structured. I'm talking specifically here about philanthropic foundations, private foundations, because the law is very rigid on how and why. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't be innovative. Like, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation created RFCC that I spoke about earlier. That is entirely within the rules. That is entirely something that is checked out and approved by the IRS, that allows us to invest in catalytic capital investments. One of the things that we also did in 2019 when COVID hit is we went to the market. The Rockefeller Foundation leveraged its endowment to issue a bond to raise additional capital that we could not have had to help in the COVID response. And so there are ways that you can be innovative within the strict rules of the IRS, and that allows us to be innovative and come up with these new instruments. All right, but still, we are the foundations and private philanthropy, and to a large extent, even multilateral development agencies and bilateral development agencies are limited in what they can fund by the various laws and regulations. So there is a balance. Innovation is a solution in some cases, and we've seen that work very successfully with what we did when we started thinking about how to respond to a post-COVID world, and we've seen that working very well, Frank.
Yeah. And it's really, on one hand, William, actually, we are truly blessed to be in Africa, where our diverse set of challenges offer a perfect sandbox for us to experiment with all of these new approaches and innovations and instruments. I mean, if you think about it, M-Pesa would probably never have worked in the US because just the regulations were restrictive. But in Kenya, the regulators let M-Pesa thrive first, and they put regulation around it. And so in many parts of Africa, innovation precedes regulation, unlike in many other parts of the West. You look at Zipline in Rwanda, same story. So we're truly blessed to be in Africa, where the glass is no longer half empty, it's half full. And it's really for this impact community to drive up our efforts in filling that glass. So what are we each in our own capacity doing to step up and try and create the kind of innovation that fills that glass? And so what we're also trying to create within the AVPA ecosystem is to bring together this diverse set of players doing grant sector equity and others doing non-financial services like advisory and academia. So together and a collective, we can do a better job of combining our various strengths and innovations to address this community challenge. Because I think what I'm hearing is also, William, the old days of aid working on its own or private sector working on its own are gone. We need to think about how we can be better at collaborating together. Now, before I go any further, Abby, can you get the next two slide sessions up? I just one more question for you, William. We talk about private sector. We've seen how the devaluation of our currencies have really shattered our economies in the last couple of months. Should we be looking to unlock local private capital? Is that part of what we need to be striving to do as we strive to bring in private capital into this space?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Frank. Look, from my perspective, and having spent time in government and in private sector, now in philanthropy, I think that we in Africa should be agnostic where our development and commercial capital comes from. If it's local, we should take it. If it's foreign, we should take it. But I do want to make some points here that I think would be of interest to this wide network of AVPA. So, there is a lot of discussion today around climate change. Commitments have been made at COP 25 to 27, that actually now looking towards getting to net zero, all right? And in order for the world to get a net zero, and I know there's a risk for us not meeting that goal, but there is going to be a flurry of activity, Frank, of companies shifting their manufacturing processes from the current processes that are heavily reliant on carbon emitting processes to looking to more green energy sources that will allow them to continue operating at the levels that they are. Now, there are two ways they can do that. They can either rebuild or retool or reprocess their current operations in their countries in the global north, or they can say, you know what, there's plenty of sunshine in Africa. There's a huge opportunity for solar. Why don't I go and start a new facility in Africa that can take advantage of all these opportunities? All right. Africa should set itself up to do just that, to attract those kind of companies. We should be gearing up ourselves to receive the manufacturing capability that wants to take advantage of our natural resources. Just like China and Taiwan and the Southeast Asian countries took advantage of the shift of manufacturing from the United States and Europe to less expensive Asia, we should now be looking and setting ourselves up to accept those manufacturing opportunities that are for sure going to need to change at some level. And it might make more sense for most of those manufacturing companies to think about establishing those entities here in Africa. We should set ourselves up to accept that. The second thing I need to say is that carbon finance, carbon credit projects and carbon finance is becoming another growing area of access to finance. And for countries like ours where development dollars are few and diminishing, and the fiscal space is tightening, a new innovative space like carbon financing is somewhere we should be looking at. Africa has still got the largest amount of land available today that is uncultivated, that could all be put towards carbon credit programs. We've got the largest forests. We've got the weather. We have so many opportunities for us to establish this, but we need to organize. We need to organize ourselves in a way that makes sure that we can take advantage of these opportunities. And so, those who are either in government, but even those who are working in venture capital and so on, funding such projects, put your money into such projects, because I can assure you this wave is coming. This wave of numerous, we have the highest quality carbon credit programs. We have the ability to create the highest quality carbon credit programs that will make our carbon credits more attractive than anywhere else in the world. And we can do it on a voluntary basis. And so these are areas that we should be looking at as future sources of finance and development capital, Frank.
Yeah, and as Abby just runs the poll at the moment, just for us to see, the composition of the people on the call today, we can see there's a significant amount of people that are ecosystem builders who are trying to influence the broader ecosystem. And to that end, William, as we talk about the restrictions of laws that are probably limiting, for example, some of the foundation work, one of the questions I ask myself all the time is, how can we help adjust some of those laws? How can we help influence those laws to be more relevant to today's reality? So just to quote some of the work we're doing, we are part of so I sit on the South African National Advisory Board for Impact Investing, and we are talking to the tax authorities here about changing some of the laws to allow foundations, for example, to be able to do some stuff around revenue generation. Because right now, if you look at some outcome-based funding models, as a foundation, you can only now come in as an outcome payer, not as an initial investor. But we need to be able to be in this space where foundation money grants can go in to fund as an investor and to be paid, later for outcomes achieved. So there is need for us to review the existing regulations around some of that stuff. And if there's anyone here who's looking at, who's working in government and development agencies, I think it would be really good to see what can be done in that space. So the world is moving. Africa is moving. We need to evolve with it, and we need to see how we can make the environment conducive to this kind of stuff. Abby, do you want to run the second poll before we start thinking about just looking at where we go with the Q&A session. I'd highly encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A chat, because I'm going to start taking a few more questions from the audience. Some of you, I may ask you to come in for comments. So for example, William, on the issue of carbon credits, absolutely. You know, if we think about Africa as a region, we only contribute about 4% of global greenhouse gases. And of which 2% of that is roughly South Africa, of which 1% is ESCOM. So there's the carbon credit market is massive on the continent, especially if we can get it to the point of it reaching the people on the ground, and they can benefit from those carbon credits. We'll have cracked this. I know someone like Oscar Njuguna in Kenya under the Nairobi International Finance Center is working on a carbon exchange. And Oscar, if you are willing to talk about it, please let me know. I'll give you a space to talk about the stuff that you're doing in that space. But it's good to see this stuff around the understanding of Catalytic Capital. The reason is because why we're doing this program is we're building up towards a Catalytic Capital training program that will be rolling out from sometime in April. We are very happy for support from MacArthur Foundation and the C3 Consortium, of which Rockefeller is one of them. So if you do feel you want to learn a bit more about Catalytic Capital and how you can better understand this space, how you can get to a point where you are asking yourself, for every dollar that I'm investing of concessional or grant capital, for example, how much am I getting in leverage? Am I unlocking $5, $10, $20 of private capital, for example, to come in some of the projects that we're part of? Because that's what exactly Catalytic Capital is about. It's about leverage. It's about trying to see how we can magnify the impact of the scarce concessional or grant capital we have to crowd in as much private capital as possible, and really help the private sector come into a better understanding of this profit and purpose convergence. So it's good to see that there is a large number of organizations that are not practicing Catalytic Capital, because for me, that is an entrepreneurial opportunity for us to find a solution to this effect. So William, we've spoken about all of this, and I keep saying, we should be teaching the world as Africa about impact. No one has the kind of opportunities to practice different impact models, test different financial models, and the diversity that Africa has. In fact, in our conversations in building out the universities program, one of the things why we were able to work with the Impact and Sustainable Finance Consortium faculty, which is about 100 global business schools teaching impact and sustainable finance, is they don't have impact content to teach. All of that is sitting in the global south. So anyone who's playing the impact space, any true player, has to be playing in Africa. William, in your view, why haven't we led the world in this space? What is the problem? Why aren't we the go-to place for people who want to learn about impact?
That's a loaded question, Frank, but I will try to answer it. Look, I completely agree with you. I mean, you can't have better impact than doing programs in places where there is a high level of disadvantaged communities and poverty and lack of basic social facilities and structures, because $1 can go a lot longer on impact in those kinds of spaces than in many other places around the world. So completely agree with you that is the case. There's a myriad of reasons, I think, why we haven't. I mean, I alluded earlier to the fact that I don't think we've leveraged the private sector enough. I don't think that we have supported platforms where private and public sector can work together to advance that agenda. And I think we could do a lot more of that. I think we haven't exploited our resources, whether they be human or mineral or whatever, as best as we could. The development model that many African countries have pursued has been a development model that was established pre-independence and just post-independence. And they've changed very little since then, all right? And so, where government is essentially the driver of development, okay? And so I think there definitely needs to be a shift, and governments need to now take a step back and say, actually, what we need to be doing is create a space for the private sector to invest, support them with infrastructure, support them with an enabling environment, legislation, so on and so forth, and then let the private sector do its thing. I don't think we've done enough of that, honestly, to do that. Look, I think that there has been a lot stacked against Africa. I talked earlier about the risk rating that many African countries are achieving, and then therefore accessing capital has been a challenge, no doubt about that. Many countries in Africa are debt distressed as we speak today. We need to change that. We need to change that. We need to find ways where development finance institutions can work with us to give us credit that is affordable and that does not continue adding to the distress that we're already in. That's one sort of broad area. I think another broad area is we haven't focused on infrastructure. I think that in Africa, the infrastructure deficit, they say, is worth, I think, $1.5 trillion. And we're just talking about roads, railways, bridges, ports, that kind of thing. There hasn't been sufficient, infrastructure development. I think that has really held us back. I really feel that with the proper development and focus on infrastructure, that would really unleash the private sector to develop more. And then the third thing, I think, Frank, is that we in Africa are still trading with each other at very low levels. Intra-Africa trade is, less than 15% of global trade, okay? Which is a shame, but also speaks to the fact that there are many barriers to Africans trading with each other. It's much more expensive for me to buy palm oil from Ghana than from Indonesia. Okay, if I want to process palm oil in Kenya, for example, and I look at the price differential of buying the palm oil in Ghana as opposed to buying it in Indonesia or Southeast Asia, you will often find that the palm oil from Southeast Asia is much, much cheaper, more sustainable, and in quantities and qualities that you require than that from Ghana. And a lot of that is just a lack of infrastructure, a lack of a road infrastructure, rail infrastructure that could get that palm oil to Kenya at a price that is competitive. And that's true of many other value chains. I used palm oil as an example, but it's true of many other value chains. But the good news is that all of this is changing, all right? I talked earlier about the reforms, the Bridgetown Initiative, around reforming our global financial institutions to start looking at lower and middle income countries in a different sort of sphere with a different lens when it comes to lending. I'm sure that those reforms will go through and we'll see a lot more capital available to lower and middle income countries. I think the infrastructure gap is being addressed. Today, there is no convening of African leaders that I go to where they don't talk about infrastructure. They don't talk about integrating their infrastructure with one another. They don't talk about how they can align their own infrastructure development with their neighbors and with wider countries in the region. So that's going on. Then we also have the China's Belt and Road Initiative that is admittedly very much focused on building infrastructure that allows China to trade with the globe more efficiently, but along those corridors that it is building will allow us to also access that infrastructure and sort of utilize that for our own economic development. And then third, with the signing of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is going to create the biggest trading bloc in the world, I think there is hope around free trade going amongst African countries. So if these three things work together, access to finance, the building of infrastructure, and the implementation and operationalization of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, you can begin to see that we will begin to move the needle on some of these things. And it's good news that today those are the things that people are talking about.
Fantastic, William. Excellent. Mike Achanja asked, who is best placed to drive this process of creating meeting of minds and governments, philanthropy and private sector? I think ecosystem players like us, working with the likes of the NABs, I think would be best placed. So stuff like what we're going to be doing at the Africa Impact Summit in July is some of the places, but there are various platforms through which, for sure at AVPA, this is a major focus area for us, is how do we especially bring governments into this space, but also trying to shift mindsets, helping the private sector see that there's no conflict between profit and purpose, and helping the development sector to believe that that sector is not only designed to take grants, and that can be a lot more flexible in that end. So Mike, that's something where we focus on. Nomsa Daniels asked about outcome-based financing. Governments seem to have an issue supporting high-impact businesses that are bringing innovative solutions to challenges in education, health, etc. How can philanthropic capital help to change that bias? Nomsa, one of the biggest things I find, and my experience is, we're dealing with that paradigm shift of how things need to be done differently. And a big challenge of that is there's a lot of unconscious incompetence. People don't know they don't know. When you start talking about these issues of blended finance and innovative finance, guarantees and outcome-based financing, you lose people in the process. So there's a fundamental need just to develop the understanding of this new space of innovative finance, both from traditional development players, private sector players, and governments. And in this particular initiative, we need to be deliberate about making sure we don't leave governments behind. They've got to understand the initiatives and the changes coming in. So there's a whole need and demand for human capital development. So that's the reason why, in addressing root causes of that nature, as AVPA, we're looking to do some university programs. But in the meantime, we're running our own program around impact investing, because we find that it's the penny drops once people understand that this actually, for example, you look at outcome-based financing, models like that would even help fight corruption in Africa, because you don't get paid if you don't deliver on certain outcomes. Okay, would bring a lot more efficiencies to things like tenders, for example, if we adopted outcome-based financing. So something like that would be great. Oscar, if you don't mind unmuting yourself, I'd love to bring you in to just talk about, we talk about governments. And I want to use your organization as an example of what are governments doing differently to adapt to this new space. And I know you run the Nairobi International Finance Center. So Oscar, if you don't mind, do you mind unmuting yourself and speaking to some of the stuff you're doing for about 2-3 minutes, plus also to William's comment about carbon credits and what you're looking into that space?
Yeah, thanks, Frank and William. I don't know if you can hear me clearly now. Yes,
we can.
Great. Thank you very much.
We can hear you, but we can't see you, Oscar.
Oh yeah, no, that's intentional. my voice is much better than my looks. So the NIFC is a government agency under the National Treasury, where we are really creating, or we're working towards creating an improved operating environment. And what that means is really trying to address some of the structural impediments that prevent more capital from flowing into Kenya and across the continent. So introducing more predictability around tax for investment, for PE, venture capital, etc. We're trying to address some of the operational issues that exist around work permits and things like that to enable people to do what they want to do in Kenya and other countries. But I think, to Frank's point, what I've realized in my time in working to establish the center is that government, I think, really would like to do more to facilitate and make things happen. What we don't always have is the capacity and the know-how and the capability to know what private sector really needs. And so it was really helpful. I mean, this discussion, I think, is key because you can see where the pinch points are. But I think to the points that have been raised by William, etc., if we knew, for example, what specific tax issue exists around, let's say, capital gains tax, we can then work to try to address that in a practical way, taking into account the constraints that government has from a fiscal perspective. But I think there's a willingness to do that. It's obviously not across the board, it's not everywhere, but it does exist. And so I think that I'm pleased, I'm really pleased to see initiatives like this. And I think we need to get around the table and try to put together some pilots, some ideas, and say, okay, yes, Rockefeller want to do something, they've got some good ideas. Frank and the team at AVPA and others can help to structure it. So then we, from a government perspective, what needs to be changed? What needs to be tweaked? Which double taxation agreement needs to be put in place? And we can address that. So for example, we've got an incentive for establishing a carbon exchange. I think it's one of the first certainly in this part of the continent, because we recognize that carbon credits provide a revenue stream for businesses and have been doing so for a number of years. And we need to try to really fast track the development of the ecosystem to enable that to happen faster. So we've been doing some work on that, trying to partner with a global exchange, and happy to talk about this more in due course and share stuff on our website. But it's exciting, and I think we're really trying to do as much as we can, but we need help. We need the technical know-how that exists in the private sector and the public sector and in the DFI sector that can then help us to move faster rather than the sort of slow bureaucracy of government machinery. And I know, William, in your previous life, you will know about this in great detail. So I'll pause there and happy to answer any more questions.
Yeah. So this is the beginning of exciting conversations that we're hoping to build. And part of what we want to do is take these conversations into in country, so that some of our regional convenings we're hoping to have will be impact conversations to unpack these with your colleagues and peers in the impact space within your respective countries. We'll be looking to do this kind of stuff virtually as well, so we can also make sure that we're also cross-pollinating across multiple countries. So before William does his closing remarks, Abby, do you just want to put up the summary slides again, so we can just bring a couple of things back to the surface before as we get to the end of this. So just a quick reminder on the activities for everyone who probably missed the initial slides that was shared at the beginning of the webinar. A lot of stuff's going to be happening here. We'll share these when we share the recording. But this particular webinar is part of a program we're doing with C3 Consortium that will culminate in a Catalytic Capital training program sometime in April. The next webinar is going to be on February 23rd with Natasha Dinham of Roots of Impact. So please register for that as well, where we'll be talking about now the application of Catalytic Capital in scaling and seeding of initiatives. So get a lot more granular. What William has done is given us a high-level introduction on this subject, and we'll start getting a lot more granular in days to come. Abby, if you go back, a couple of big things to also look out for is, please, if you're interested in this training program, send us information on AVPA. We've got restricted spaces for that program. There's a couple other things coming in the next couple of weeks. As I mentioned, I'm starting a podcast series because I felt there's not enough being told about impact stories in Africa, so I'm going to do something about it. So from first week of February, we'll be running an AfriPact webinar series. Follow me or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'll post a lot about this in days to come. There's the Africa Impact Summit in Cape Town, 12th, 13th, 14th of July. Look out for that. And there are ongoing programs of AVPA, like the Impact Investing Fellowship Program, that is something. So on the podcast series, if you've got interesting impact stories of Africans doing some really cool stuff, people who are addressing difficult challenges in innovative ways, people who are, I want to go extreme. I want to be able to feature young people, women, people from Francophone Africa, North Africa, South Africa, but people who have kind of models that the rest of the continent could learn from and replicate. Please send them to that email address. We'll be very happy to feature as many of them as possible. It could be corporates, it could be small organizations, social enterprises, NGOs, entrepreneurs. So long as they're playing in the impact space, we'll be happy to feature them. And then the next slide, before we pull in William to just give his closing remarks, I just first of all want to say thank you to everyone for who made it to join us today. Remember, this is the beginning of a series of these webinars, and please register for the next one in February. William, over to you. You're muted.
Thank you. Thank you, Frank. I'll also just add a word of thanks to yourselves and the whole team for facilitating this. Thank everyone for taking the time to listen. There's been some really good discussion. I was actually just following the discussion on the chat there. There were some good questions, Frank. Maybe you and I can discuss those questions separately, so we can get back to the people who asked them. But there's a good debate there, and I think there's good engagement. Look, I am very optimistic about where we are today. There are things happening that suggest to me that there is going to be a shift. This whole drive towards localization and using more local partners and working in country by philanthropy can only be good. This getting together by African countries, I know there's a lot of skepticism. I've seen some of that online. About whether African governments are actually serious about development. And, certainly sometimes when you see things and you read headlines, you have to wonder how serious, a government might be. But I tell you, I just came from Dakar last week at a food security summit. And some of the things you're hearing there from heads of state about what they have done in their countries and what they intend to do and how they intend to do it. It just gave me a lot of hope. Of course, there are places where there are problems. We have conflict, post-conflict areas. Those challenges exist. But today, there are more countries that are interested in solutions for their populations than there were just 20 years ago. And I think that can only be a good thing. So I'm hopeful. The African Continental Free Trade Area is now operational, and I can only see that growing. The infrastructure that we're getting, and we're working with our partners in China to build infrastructure, the number of infrastructure projects that are planned, that are being taken through the process of financing, I see those bearing fruit. And then, of course, this reform agenda of the international financial institutions, I also see that taking fruit. So I'm actually quite optimistic. And, to see so many people for deep geography, deep professionalism coming together to a webinar like this, Frank, also means that there is interest. And these are professionals who take back some of these ideas to their places of work and to the people they work with. So I think there's every reason to be optimistic. Thank you so much, everyone. And I wish everyone a lovely rest of your day.
Thank you, William. And just to wrap up the conversation around the evolving role of philanthropy, I'd like to share this slide with everyone that just challenges us to think about how we approach the different options or solutions available to us when you're trying to solve social problems. And the end goal at the end of the day is, are we driving the development that Africa requires? And this slide, I love this slide because it has a really good summary of just how you think about it. And on the Y column is willingness to pay of the end beneficiary, on the X, the ability to pay. And you can see how different things, solutions come into play. On the top left quadrant, where there's a high willingness to pay and low ability to pay, ideally is where your traditional grants go in. And this conversation has not been saying that grants don't have a place. They do have a place, and especially in Africa. For sure, that's where you need to be landing. On the bottom right is where there's a high ability to pay but low willingness to pay, is where you start looking at where you play catalytic solutions, where you use the money to build a market. You look at market-based solutions where you're using the money to leverage and crowd in private capital. And then on the top right is where you're looking at high ability to pay, high willingness to pay, is where you look at market-based solutions. And that's where you look at debt equity financing. So you'll see, as we think at the different models we can apply in catalytic investments, part of this is also how we change our paradigms and how we're moving forward in models of that we think are more suitable. So before you go necessarily just into a community and you want to invest in a problem that they've got, ask yourself, what is the attitude of the people in that community? Are they willing to buy for a problem that they have the ability to pay for? Okay. Because if they are, don't necessarily assume that these people just want free things and all they want is for you to give them, because also that puts pressure on the sustainability of the model and your solution. So this is the kind of debates I'd like us to keep having, but this is what we're going to be discussing in the Catalytic Capital Investing Program. And I really look forward to engaging as many of you as possible. Thank you so much for your time, and to the team behind the scenes, Abby, Vuiso, and them. Thank you so much, William, Umuliza. Thank you, William, always available when we need you the most. So appreciate it. The Rockefeller folks in the back, thank you so much for everything. Have a nice day.
All right, bye.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.